When we last left our intrepid narrator, they were about to tell their family that they would be flying to Cuba in 3 days. Beyond the general implications about visiting with potentially insufficient preparation, mind you, visiting a foreign country targeted with sanctions from a world power, there was also, the family trauma to consider. So, no big deal, right? In December 2022, I became the first member of my family to return to Cuba in over 70 years. Getting there was a matter of chance and free will, and involves my family of exiles, 2 decades of living and studying internationally, and a sacred tree. This is the true story behind the making of HAVANA Syndrome, the fictional podcast.
Today, I can announce that the United States has agreed to formally reestablish diplomatic relations with the Republic of Cuba.
You know there's story going around about the CIA and they're trying to get, sending in the folks to get Castro.
Cuba maintains close relations with Russia and China, providing these actors with influence platforms to foment an anti-American
State
agenda.
Court has ruled on the case regarding temporary custody of Elian Gonzalez.
I think you ought to have that. It's incredible. I don't believe there's a thing in the world to it, and I don't think you ought to seriously consider it, but I think you ought to know about it.
The progress that we mark today is yet another demonstration that we don't have to be imprisoned by the past. When something isn't working, we can and will change.
Let's talk about Cubans in the United States. Obviously, Cubans are overwhelmingly concentrated in Florida, particularly South Florida. Early waves of Cuban immigration, pre-revolution, landed in Tampa. In fact, Ybor City, near Tampa, was a former cigar factory and company town that drew Cuban laborers. Florida's oldest restaurant is Cuban and in Ybor City, called the Columbia. It's got great food, I can confirm. However, Miami is most famous for and most concentrated with Cubans. This is where my family landed, on my dad's side. My grandfather actually participated in the development of Hialeah, the famously Cuban neighborhood in Miami, considered Little Havana. And my grandmother ran a New Age store in Coral Gables for decades, called the Fairies Ring. But that's another story. In political terms, Cuban Americans break from the traditional Latine or Hispanic voting bloc that trends Democrat. They are mostly Republican, and this can be attributed to a number of factors. The biggest one is how they have been courted by conservatives in Miami and beyond. The notorious Bay of Pigs incident in 1961, that was orchestrated by this specific political bloc and cost the lives of 300 anti-Castro Cubans.
The United States has committed no aggression against Cuba, and no offensive has been launched from Florida or from any other part of the United States.
Cuban Army pilots opened the first phase of organized revolt with bombing raids on 3 military bases. 2 of the B-26 light bombers then seek asylum in Florida.
Any unilateral American intervention in the absence of an external attack upon ourselves or an ally would have been contrary to our traditions and to our international obligations.
In the Guatemalan foothills, there's a mysterious training depot where some of the raiders may have been based. The government there denies that Cubans are among the soldiers being instructed, but observers have said otherwise.
But let the record show, if the nations of this hemisphere should fail to meet their commitments against outside communist penetration, then I want it clearly understood that this government will not hesitate in meeting its primary obligations, which are to the security of our nation.
President Nixon and the Watergate scandal was driven by a handful of Cuban exiles and their handler, all who had also been involved in the Bay of Pigs. In fact, there's an HBO series called White House Plumbers that details this particular connection, and it stars Woody Harrelson.
We're going to hit the DNC at the Watergate.
Howard, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
We strike tonight. These are the wrong doors.
What? He has the wrong tools.
This backlash to communist-driven revolution has been seen in other immigrant populations in the United States. HBO's The Sympathizer fictionalizes a similar dynamic play out among Vietnamese Americans.
Saigon, 1975. That was a man with two faces. You are the only one I can trust.
So why do I bring this up? Well, to give you a deeper picture in how my family factors into these generalities, and why reports of Havana Syndrome were particularly of interest to the Cuban-American political establishment. The stereotype of the right-wing Cuban-American comes from the fact that the majority of Cubans who fled during the revolution and landed in Miami were primarily white, wealthy landowners. These Cubans were more aligned with the military dictator, former President Fulgencio Batista, who is also heavily associated with U.S. interests, and the American Mafia. We'll get to that later. My family's political associations, and the reason they fled, is a little more complicated. You see, my grandmother was a passionate communist in her teenage years. Her father and her uncle, my great-grandfather and his brother, actively participated in the revolution. That side of my family are notorious rabble-rousers, in fact. That's the side that participated in previous conflicts, in fact. The Spanish Civil War, the Spanish-American War. They were considered upper-middle class, Spanish Cubans. Valuable allies, class traitors, who could provide the resources and means to fight Batista. It wasn't until after Fidel Castro began to crack down on political dissidents that my great-grandfather began to also dissent. According to my family stories, he was then arrested and tortured in prison. Honestly, I don't know all the details. I have only been given broad strokes about this by my family. And obviously, I don't want to dig or share much more than they were willing to tell me. From my understanding, though, this was unfortunately pretty common in the post-revolution years, and this is what forced my great-grandfather and his family to exile into Miami. It is also the reason why that side of the family became fiercely patriotic conservative capitalists. I grew up knowing the general story about my family's reason for leaving Cuba. As I got older, my family was willing to share more about their time in Cuba, as well as the lingering after effects that tested and in some ways destroyed parts of my family. My grandfather, before he married my grandmother, remembers trying to escape the gun in the streets of Havana. I learned that I am related to other figures in the Cuban-American story. By marriage, I'm actually distantly related to Batista. By blood, to the patricidal Menendez brothers. Yes, there is a cathartic reason why I named the characters the way that I did in Havana Syndrome. My own grand-uncle was caught up in drug-fueled violence that plagued Miami in the 80s and was imprisoned for years. But we don't talk about Bruno. It was also later that I learned that my great-granduncle, my great-grandfather's brother, stayed behind and actually was an active part of the Cuban government for some decades after. I met him once, in fact, in his own exile in Spain when I was a kid. My dad, still in the U.S. military at the time, was probably not supposed to meet with anyone associated with the Cuban government, former or otherwise, but he was family. So, there you go. I also grew up with a particular story that surrounds my birth. My great-grandfather was present for it. So, the story goes that my dad and his friend decided to smoke a traditional Cuban cigar in celebration of, my father's first child. When my great-grandfather realized what they were doing, he blew up at my dad. He forced him to promise not to partake in any Cuban cigars, in Cuban rum, nothing, until, quote, that bastard is dead. That bastard being Fidel Castro. When Castro did pass away in 2016, it was not really a celebratory event for my family, like you may have seen from videos of Miami at the time. My great-grandfather had died many years before, so it was a bittersweet kind of thing. To me, it seemed like a weight had been lifted from some of my family members. But the memories, the generational trauma, remained. All this to lead up to the point where I announced to my family that I'm heading to Cuba. It goes without saying, I worried it would be a difficult conversation. I was worried to hear pushback, even if I knew I would go anyway. This is the kind of generational trauma that I was struggling with, hoping to understand, if not exorcise, the only way I knew how: by writing a story about it. I called my dad first. He's retired from the military by now, but his first response to his child is still to consider their safety. He was supportive, made sure to let me know to reach out to my aunt, related by marriage, who was also planning a trip to Cuba later that month to compare notes. He also made sure to remind me not to tell anyone official that I planned to write about HAVANA syndrome, even as framing it as a fictional story. Then I called my grandparents. They were similarly chill, relaxed about the announcement, looking back on it. My grandmother gave me a list of places to visit in Havana, and my grandfather mentioned his old place of work he wanted me to see if it was still there, a beautiful old mansion in the Vedado neighborhood. I gave promises to be careful and to take lots of photos. They gave me their blessing. It goes without saying, but I still felt that history. Those memories, the trauma bubble up and unconsciously offered. Like a sin eater, I felt compelled to carry it with me to Cuba, to see if I could do something about it, resolve it, transform it somehow. Heal the syndrome, if you will. Next episode, we're going to talk about what it takes to move between worlds and navigating TSA. Stay tuned.